Greetings, I am Herbert Erberderp, and today I'm going to show you how I painted this warehouse. This model is a 28mm scale foamed PVC kit from Plastcraft Games that I built quite some time ago. I wanted to paint this pretty quickly, just to get it ready for the tabletop, so this isn't going to be like a display piece or anything like that. As per usual, I start with priming. This model has been primed for a long time and I've forgotten exactly what primer I used, but it's black. What matters is it's primed. Then I fairly messily paint the inside of the building with dark grey, though I don't think it's really all that dark. This paint is a high flow acrylic by Global Colours. In this painting video I'm only going to be using artist's acrylics because it's not really cost effective to use regular miniature paints like Vallejo for this kind of thing. The rest of the colours I'll be using are from the Jo Sonja's range, like this here Provincial Beige, which I used to paint the bricks. I'm doing this fairly roughly and the brush I'm using isn't that good. It's a bit scratchy, but that's okay, at least for this purpose. I'm mostly interested in getting the colour into the mortar lines, but painting them individually would be painful, so I just paint all the bricks as well. I ended up with a pretty nice solid coating of the Provincial Beige. It's obviously a bit messy around the windows and corners, but they'll be different colours anyway, so there's plenty of opportunity for corrections. I then tried to add the brick colour by dry brushing on some Indian Red Oxide. I was trying to be pretty careful with this, but still I managed to get quite a bit of the red onto the mortar bits where I don't want it. This is partly because I'm just bad, but also largely because the mortar detail isn't that deep and it's pretty easy to get the paint in there. As I'm sure you can see, it's not the worst, but it's not really how I wanted it and I'm not entirely happy with it. So I added more Indian Red Oxide to make the bricks a nice solid colour, and then I applied a coat of gloss varnish. This was a gloss varnish I got from the art supply shop because using small bottles of miniature specific gloss varnish like the paint would be a waste of money. When the gloss varnish has set, I apply Provincial Beige over the top of it, and then I wipe it off with a paper towel. That's probably not the best thing to use, but it's what I had on hand. I wasn't totally satisfied the first time, so I reapplied the beige and tried again, this time using the paper towel with a little bit less pressure. I did this in small sections just to make it a bit easier to remove the Provincial Beige. The result is something like this. Well, it's exactly this. As you can see, it's not exactly perfect, but at least the bricks are kind of solid looking. I apply some more of the red over the bricks with a soft brush to try and cover a bit more of the beige, and to try and make the red look even more solid. It does add a little bit, but not much. If I'm honest, I was a bit disappointed with how this worked. The mortar gaps weren't deep enough to make it easy to dry brush the bricks neatly, and I didn't want to paint them individually, so I decided to simplify the paint job going forward. I then painted the corners of the building. Well, I had already painted them, but I'm repainting them here to make it look a bit neater. I kind of like the way this stands out by just being a more solid colour compared to the brickwork. Then I painted the doors using Hooker's Green. Hookers. This took a couple of coats to properly cover the splashes of beige, but that also adds a little bit of colour variance and I think that's a good thing. I tried to apply this neatly, though I did get a little bit onto the brickwork. I was probably using too big a brush, but that's okay, it can be fixed later. I used the same colour to paint the roof supports. These will barely be visible and I don't think they really need to be painted. After all, this is to be used as a gaming piece and not a display model. But it's not a bad idea to paint in here anyway. You might see these beams through the windows or something. Something that will definitely be visible is the roof, so I painted that with Hooker's Green too. It appears really dark when painted over the black primed parts, so I do a couple of coats. I decided against trying anything fancy like putting a different colour in the gaps between the roof tiles here. Don't forget to apply this on the little roofy bit on the support part as well. I think this is going to look less consistent with the rest of the green on the model than I wanted, but that's probably a bit more realistic than not, really. I then apply the Hooker's Green to the window surrounds. Again, a couple of layers were needed to get a good solid coat of this, and you can see I'm still using the bigger brush. My plan was to do this kind of roughly, though I was trying to be as neat as possible, and then fixing it later with smaller brushes. I also paint the supporty bits on the internal walls green. I figure these are more important to paint than the ones on the removable part, because they'll be visible during gameplay when the roof is removed. Also, for some reason auto white balance is on, and that's why the colour keeps going all wibbly wobbly. Very frustrating. I then dry brush the doors with green oxide. I do this mostly with downward strokes. I try to hit all of the edges of the door and its slidey thing at the top, and I run the brush down the front of the part in an attempt to create a worn, scratched and faded look. I decided this was a little bit light, so I went over it again with pine green, which is a little bit darker. I feel like having both colours on this makes it look a little bit more interesting. Then I use the same colour to roughly dry brush a highlight around the windows, and I also used it to dry brush the roof. I drag this downwards to kind of help with a streaky rained-on look. The aim here is to make it look as though the roof tiles have been fading and getting dirty over the years and have come to have an inconsistent colour to them. I then decided it was time to attach the roof parts to the supporty bit. The instructions suggest that the central support part be glued in with the roof parts left loose, but I think it would be impossible to get my hands in there to manipulate figures hiding inside, so I used epoxy to permanently fix the roof parts to the support. As you can see, it's a bit of a mess inside. I decided against painting the inside of the roof any further, it'll rarely be seen anyway. Next, I get the provincial beige out again and use it to paint a kind of thick mortar line around the windows. This is an attempt to neaten up the areas of the green, but it will also make the windows stand out and look a little bit more defined. I tried to do this as neatly as I could, but as you can see, there are some imperfections. That's okay. I'm sure a structure like this wouldn't be absolutely perfect anyway. As you can see, I've also painted this along the solid red oxide corners of the building. I think it's an interesting look, but I do think the beige lines are a bit too big, so it's time for some more Indian red oxide. I use it to paint in the bricks against the beige parts. As you can imagine, this is quite time consuming, but it's not nearly as bad as painting each individual brick would have been. Some of the bricks are defined enough to make painting them easy, but not all of them are like that. I take my time and am as careful as I can be. Even so, it's still a little bit rough, but that's fine. These are places where the bricks might be a bit more damaged and chipped away. That's what I'm telling myself anyway. As you can see on the right, I've finished this step, but on the left I haven't. I think you might agree that the right side looks much neater and more realistic. There's a lot of wonky, not quite straight lines. I think that gives this a kind of old-style hand-built look, and it will probably look quite neat from a distance on the gaming table too. Once I've finished with that, I neaten up the areas of the green that I think need it. I'm never going to get perfect straight hand-painted lines, but I can get close enough. I use the raised edges of the window surrounds where I can to improve neatness. I then tidy up the grey on the inside. Eventually, I felt like I'd got everything neatened up enough, and I applied another coat of gloss varnish. This isn't 100% necessary, but I feel like it will help when wiping away the next layers of acrylic with minimal damage to the existing colours. I figured I might as well just do my weathering with acrylic too, rather than using the enamels I often use on my vehicles. I make a mix of brown earth and carbon black. It's roughly 50-50, but I wasn't exactly precise in mixing this. I apply it to the roof a small section at a time. Before it can dry too much, I wipe it off with a rag in a downward motion so that it looks like the grime and dirt are being washed down the roof by rain. This is a messy but simple enough process. I do pretty much exactly the same thing to the walls, streaking it down to look as though grime and dust have accumulated on the walls and been washed downward by rain. Using acrylics for this is a bit less versatile than using enamels. Once it's on, it's a bit harder to remove, but I think this has worked well enough. Next, I do the same thing again, except this time I'm using carbon black. I thin this with water much more than the previous mix, and I try to apply a bit less of it to the model. It is a little bit less obvious on the roof, but on the walls it stands out quite a bit. I went a bit more heavily with this than I had intended, but when it's all wiped down it doesn't look too bad. You can also put some water on the rag to remove bits that have dried a bit already. The result is a quite dirty looking wall that I didn't get a very good shot of, but you'll see it later. Then I put some of the water that I used to clean the brown brush into the black mix and made an even thinner wash that I used to paint the interior. I brush it on really messily, and then use my rag to wipe it around and make it look a little bit more consistent and less brush strokey. I also did this on the walls so they would blend in with the floor. It's simple but effective enough. The interior doesn't really need any detail anyway. I figured I might try to make some lighter coloured rain streaks on the roof, and for this I made a mix of provincial beige and black. I'm not sure of the ratio that I used, I just kind of mixed them together until it was a gross tan beigey colour that I wanted. I apply this streaking downward, obviously, and then wiping it off, exactly like the previous weathering steps. I found this worked quite well if I applied it onto a damp surface. It ended up being kind of subtle, which is what I wanted. Then I figured why not try adding some mud splatters along the bottom of the structure. I made a thin mix of provincial beige and brown earth, probably something like 2 parts beige to 1 part brown earth. I then diluted that quite a bit, making it something like 40% paint to 60% water. I used an envelope as a shield to protect the upper layers from excess splatter, and then I used an old toothbrush to flick the paint onto the model. You probably don't want to use your regular toothbrush for this. Well, maybe you do, but I don't. Then I made a thin mix of just plain brown earth and splattered that onto the model in the same way. Like with all of the other weathering steps, I gently wiped this downwards with my now very dirty rag. These mud splatters probably aren't the most realistic and convincing weathering, but I figured as long as I didn't go over the top it would look fine, especially at the sort of distance you would normally be seeing this on the table. And I figured that was about all I was going to be doing with this model, so I applied a matte varnish. This varnish is also from the art supply store. It doesn't result in as nice and flat a finish as, say, AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish would, but that's okay. It does the trick well enough. It looks more matte in person. The bright lights I'm using here are bound to cause reflections and shiny bits. I wouldn't say that I'm thrilled with the result I got here. I mean, it's okay, even good. It just hasn't turned out quite how I wanted it to. But the important thing is I have another piece of terrain painted to use when playing Bolt Action, and it should look quite decent on the table. The thing that annoyed me was the malarkey with the bricks and how shallow the mortar gaps were. Trying to dry brush it wasn't as effective as I'd wanted it to be, and caused the whole thing to take a lot longer than I'd wanted. It's not really a huge issue, but it did kind of cause me to care a little bit less about the model, so I painted it a bit more simply and with less highlighting than I originally intended. In the end, a simple paint job is good enough and it does look fine, and it will definitely be much better than having a plain black uninteresting building in my upcoming Bolt Action Battle Report videos. The kit does have some window glazings that I could have installed, but I decided against it. I didn't think they looked quite right for this building, and I think having the empty window frames gives the look of a somewhat abandoned little workshop. Or maybe the windows have been destroyed by a nearby explosion or something. I prefer it that way from a gameplay standpoint too. You can put infantry inside and then see what they might see, and also it makes it easier to determine if there's a line of sight to them so you know if you can shoot them or not. Also, it might help them not be forgotten. Not that I would ever forget where I've left my infantry at all. Nope, not me. Anyway, as I usually do, I've included a list of the colours that I've used in this video. Of course, this list is just a suggestion, particularly as you might not be able to get the Joe Sonia's line of paint in your area. If you think a different colour works better in your own modelling, then definitely use that. The main thing that I would like to get across is that it's a good idea to use the cheaper artists' acrylics when painting big structures like this. You do end up using a fair bit of paint, and it could get quite expensive rather quickly if you were to use your miniature-specific paints. I don't think I did anything especially tricky or fancy with this, but hopefully you can take something away from this video to use in your own modelling. Even if that's not the case, I hope you enjoyed this painting video. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comments section below. Also, why not do all the other things like subscribing here on YouTube, following me on social media, and watching me live stream on Twitch? And if you really like the things I do, please consider helping to support the channel over at Patreon, or perhaps by buying a mug or a t-shirt from my merch store. Links to all of those things are in the description below. And as always, I shall return soon. So until then, be excellent to each other and thanks for watching. Farewell.